Hey, look, everybody goes through bad periods of time, times where they feel uninspired, times where they feel like things are going to get better. The reality is life is so cyclical. If it's bad now, it's going to get good again, unless you continue to make really poor choices. And if it's good, it's probably going to get bad again at some point as well. And trying not to like judge those periods and just, ride it as much as you can. I always tell people like, hey, look, the worst possible thing that could happen is I'm dead. And if I'm not dead, I've got options, right? So
Yeah.
I would say that overall, I have been so fortunate to have like probably dozens of moments in my life that most people would just kill for like one of those. You
Yeah.
know, like I've had so many amazing moments that were, culminations of like really long, arduous processes. And so I always tell people like, no matter what, like I'm going to ride this thing for everything it's worth. Like I feel like I've actually had a pretty, despite like me feeling like I've made a lot of mistakes, I feel like I've had a pretty epic life. And I always tell people, hey, you know what? I'm going to show up and play the game. And,
Yeah.
that might mean I burned bright. It might mean I crash and burn, but I'm going to go hard.
So, look, the first thing I want to get into is kind of the concept of research versus experience. And obviously, how do you come to a decision when it comes to, I guess, educating the masses and also your own training philosophies and blending those two things together? Because I think a lot of people in the research space get a little bit of paralysis by analysis and don't apply it. And then conversely, there's too many people out there that sometimes just think experience trumps all. So how do you marry the two up together?
I think I learned more about coaching by actually coaching than I did uh, from research, but I think research was still crucial. I always say when you like if you build a house, um, the stuff you see that's sexy that sells the house is the flooring and the kitchen and the windows and the like all the paint. But the
The
house
marble
doesn't
bench tops.
right. The house doesn't stand up without a foundation. And
Yeah.
to me, the foundation isn't sexy. Nobody really cares about it. Unless something is wrong with it. But to me, the foundation is like a basic understanding of science. And, I think like it's important to be able to observe what happens with clients and draw your own conclusions. But at the same time, like you have to understand the concept of bias and also that, you're not isolating variables. Like you're very rarely are we changing just one thing and they're holding everything else the same. People don't really behave that way. So it's like you could add like an example would be like years ago when I started squatting. I went from squatting like once a week to twice a week, and I was like, and I got better results. And then I went to 3 times a week and I got better results. And I was like, oh, it must be the frequency. I'm doing like more frequent. I'm getting better at it. And then now if you look at the research, I mean, frequency might matter, but it's more of a tool to just distribute volume, you know? And so what I didn't understand was there was a compounding variable there, which was I was just doing more sets total, right? Um, and so I think it's easy to have an eye, like make a change and get focused on a variable that you're thinking about and then not think about some of the other variables. And at the end of the day, like, hey, it works. So, we don't have to get super caught up in like, why did it work? But I do think it's important to ask the question of why something worked. And that's really where research gets into it. Coaching, you can observe that things work, but you always have to ask yourself the question, did it, a lot of things will work. It doesn't mean that they were optimal or that something else couldn't have been better. And I think that's what people don't necessarily think about. And also, I think people get really, they don't understand the concept of selection bias either. So like, for example, I was guilty of this. I thought, like flexible dieting and macro tracking was the way for it, was going to be the future, the path forward. And it was going to make everything easy for everybody. And unfortunately, because I was known as a flexible dieting guy, guess who I attracted? People who were already bought into flexible dieting. If you're an intermittent fasting coach or you're an intermittent fasting person, you talk about intermittent fasting, guess who's coming to you? People who are already bought into intermittent fasting. And then you get good results, and then you go, oh, see, intermittent fasting is the best, or flexible dieting is the best. And you're not attuned to the fact that they're seeking you out because it's what you talk about. So I think if you don't have that scientific background, it can be hard to ask those questions of yourself sometimes. And I do think that's what's really useful, is having that scientific background so that you can critically analyze, what is it, that thing that I did, or was it something else? And it helps you to prevent you from becoming dogmatic about certain things. Because we've all seen this with coaches that go, well, this works. I mean, cutting water is a great example.
Well, and I think also, like, research actually, research changes too, right? I think like stuff that maybe people were saying 10, 15 years ago sometimes does get updated. Give us an example actually on that, like where, I guess, because you talk about it quite a lot, like people getting quite dogmatic, right? It's like, you must do keto, or you must do this, or you must do that. Give us an example where you've found something that you once believed in, which has then become disproven, that you've changed your opinion on.
I would say that I did a pretty good job over the years of, if I had an opinion that ended up getting disproven, I don't think I was ever really strong with my opinion. You know what I mean? Like I don't think I really planted my flag super strong, but there was some things that I changed my mind on.
Yeah.
A good example of that was, let's take intermittent fasting, because I was kind of talking about it. I say, well, you don't want to do any kind of fasting because it's going to, reduce your muscle mass and whatnot. And now, if we look at the studies on like your traditional intermittent fasting, like a 16-8 style fast, there's a couple studies from Grant Tinsley where they've had them resistance train within their feeding window.
Okay.
And seeing that there's no difference in muscle mass. Now, do I think that any form of fasting is the very best thing if you want to be the most muscular human possible? No. I think that's hard to pick out in a 12-week study, differences in muscle mass. But it certainly suggests that it's, you're just not going to like start stripping off muscle because you're fasting, or at least doing a traditional fast. So I think, that's something I've changed my opinion on, where it's like, hey, if you're not a bodybuilder, but you do want to build muscle, intermittent fasting's probably fine, but like maybe with these caveats, right? Another one would be LDL cholesterol. I used to kind of say, well, it's not LDL cholesterol, it's your HDL to LDL ratio that matters much more. And now we've had a slew of data that's come out showing that, hey, if you increase your HDL, it doesn't really prevent heart disease. It's just kind of a byproduct marker of being metabolically healthy. So if you're metabolically healthy, you'll probably have good HDL. But if you raise or lower HDL, it doesn't seem to really, like if you raise or lower HDL independently, like if you take drugs that raise or lower your HDL, it doesn't seem to affect heart disease. But if you raise or lower your LDL, it does affect your risk of heart disease. So I've kind of walked back, my opinion on that. And there's been other things, like I used to be a proponent of branched amino acid supplementation, fasted cardio. I've been on both sides of fasted cardio. I said, definitely do fasted cardio. And I've said, no, don't do it. It's going to strip off muscle. And now I go, doesn't seem to be better or worse. So just if you like it, do it. But it's not.
Yeah, exactly. If it fits in with your schedule to do it first thing when you wake up, and then do it, right?
Honestly, I think like a lot of the research is really pointing towards like personal preference. It's like, I think it's so unsexy that people don't like to talk about it, which is really dumb, because if you have a personal preference for something, or if you just like something, why would you not do that as long as it's not worse? You know what I mean? Like 100%. A lot of people, what happens is they do something, whether it's keto, intermittent fasting, plant-based, whatever, they get results on it. And instead of saying, well, I like this, it works for me, they kind of retroactively do fuckery to try and, explain why it's the best thing ever and everyone should be doing it.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually kind of like an insecurity thing. Like that person feels insecure about what they are doing. And so it's like they've got to get more people into it because it makes them feel validated. And it's like, why do you feel validated? It worked for you, so who cares? You know?
Yeah. And I think that is probably one of the problems with our industry is it's kind of that mindset, Jenny, comes from an individual coach or an influencer who waves the flag of their methodology, their method, and then all of a sudden, you know, everyone in their community has to follow it because it is the gospel.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
And you just have, you know, so many instances of where things have become dogma. You know, and another great one is, you know, like cutting water. This is one of my favorites for bodybuilding shows. People say, well, look at all these IFBB pros do it. I'm like, yeah, they feel like they have to because everybody does it. So it's like, have you ever seen the videos of like, there's a few prank videos where they get like, they're in a crowded area and they get like a half dozen people to start running and like pointing and like running. Guess what happens? Everyone runs. Like everybody runs. They don't know what they're running from, but they all run because humans are stupid animals. Like they're, you know, like I'm not saying everybody's, I guess.
No, but like people will unfortunately like sometimes go with that herd mentality. And even if they know intuitively that doesn't feel right to them, they'll just follow the person that's got the biggest personality and be led. I think that's something that you've done. That's something that you've done really well over the last few decades. It's like just calling shit out, you know, which kind of ties into it. Like a few other things I want to kind of go through. One of the things that we actually get in our ecosystem a lot is like, you know, veganism and fat loss and, you know, diets and stuff like that. Like, what is your thought process and what does the research show around kind of veganism in relation to like optimal human health, body composition, et cetera? What is your thoughts on that?
So if you get enough protein in, veganism doesn't seem to be worse than other forms of eating. I think, you know, the difficulty is getting enough protein in. There is concern over, you know, you probably need more protein if you're vegan, just because, especially if you're eating like intact plant sources of protein, there's not as much bioavailability because the protein in some plant proteins is bound up in the fibrous material of the plant. And so you may only have, like, you may be eating, let's say, 200 grams of protein a day, hard to get from intact plant protein. But maybe you're only getting about 70% that's bioavailable. Now, it varies between the plant source. So what I will say is, I used to say, man, you got to supplement with some animal protein. Like I would say, you know, like whey protein or whatever. Now I think there's enough evidence like that if you combine some good sources like soy and pea protein, you know, that you can get enough protein, enough high quality protein. I would just say it's probably going to be hard to do without it, like supplementing with an isolated source of protein. If the goal is to be like as muscular as possible, if lean body mass is like a big concern.
Yeah, I mean, we used to, back in our gym days when we had clients, like anyone that came in from a, you know, vegan perspective, it was like, some sort of essential amino acid or something. Like we generally found they would be, you know, need that and maybe deficient in something like zinc or whatever. But what would you say then, like on those on the protein intake, like what type of data are you looking at the moment in terms of like, how do you calculate the amount of protein a client should be having? And is that kind of based on whether they're a beginner client, an athletic client? Like, you know, talk to us about kind of that.
You know, I think for protein requirements really aren't that different across the board. It's mostly based off of lean mass, at least from what we understand. You know, I would say the research says 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. If you want to do it based on lean mass, it's probably closer to like, you know, 2 to 3 grams per kilo of lean mass. You know, I tell my clients, if you don't mind protein, if you like it or whatever, there's really no downside to just erring towards that higher end. I don't know if the benefits of protein ever completely cap out, you know, with as you increase. I think what happens is they become so incremental. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever heard of an asymptote, but in mathematics, basically you have if we have a y-axis is the benefits and the x-axis is protein intake. As it goes up, those benefits start to cap out.
Yeah.
And they may continue to go up, but it basically becomes so small of an increment of improvement that it basically you can't tell. So what I'll say is, if you get 2 grams per kilogram of lean mass, you're probably getting 95% of the benefits. If you are, up to 3 grams per kilogram, you're probably at 99.99% of the benefits. It really, you're really capping out at that point. So that's kind of.
So let's just say like the goal is 200 grams of protein per day. Do you have an optimal kind of breakdown of or like meals frequency that I should be taking that through, for example, as a human being? Like, are we wanting to spread that out over 3 meals, 5 meals, 6 meals? Like, what is the upper threshold that like human beings can actually digest per serving?
Well, there's no limit on digestion. So digestion, absorption, people kind of like, they conflate these things. They say, well, how much can you absorb? You absorb basically whatever the bioavailability is. If you're even if you eat a ton of it. So the research, there was some animal studies on this, because this is really difficult to do in humans because you've got to use you basically have to like be sampling amino acids in the colon as well as in the small intestine, and that means you've got to put basically a colostomy bag. Like you're just never going to get past an IRB to do this in people. But in animal models of this, what they tend to see is if you ramp up your protein intake, what happens is your digestion of that protein just slows down basically enough for your body to accommodate the high level of protein intake. But you absorb all of it, based on the bioavailability, right? Like if the bioavailability is 70% because you're eating a plant protein, you're absorbing 70%. But if the bioavailability of animal proteins, most of them go above 90%. If you're eating those, you're going to absorb, over 90% of it just based on the bioavailability. And so I think the question really is like, what is the anabolic cap on a meal, right? Like what is contributing towards building?
Yeah. And I'll tell you why, because like when you were out here and when we were eating dinner and stuff like that, and at the time I was doing the 1 meal a day, right?
Right.
That's when you made me feel insecure about my eating disorder. And so, but like actually, because you were like, you're gorging. I'm like, well, I'm only eating 1 meal a day, so obviously I'm fucking hungry when I eat my meal. But I actually reflected on that after you went. And so since you've been gone, I actually switched to still eating the same amount of calories, but just eating it over 4 meals a day.
Uh-huh.
Right? And so I've actually found since eating the same amount of calories over 4 meals a day, I've actually dropped body fat.
Interesting.
So like still doing 2,500 calories, but now I'm doing it over 4 meals a day kind of, so what would you, like hearing that, what would you attribute that to? Because I haven't really changed any other variables in terms of my steps or my exercise or anything like that.
Yeah, I actually don't know because, the research suggests that, meal frequency doesn't really make a difference for when it comes to fat loss.
It hasn't been massive. Like it's been about 1.5, 2.2. So about 1.5 kilos, 2.2. So what's that? Like 6 pounds or some shit like that over the last month.
That's good. That's pretty impressive. I could speculate. It may be that you feel better, and so you're kind of like subconsciously, not even without realizing it, like moving more, fidgeting more, that sort of thing. Also protein has a thermic effect. One of the downsides to like OMAD, 1 meal a day, or intermittent fasting is people don't usually get in the same amount of protein that they would get in if they were having more.
Yeah.
Right. Because like if you're focusing on 200 grams of protein a day, you're trying to eat that in 1 meal. That's a lot of protein in 1 meal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that actually probably might be it, because obviously, you have one meal a day, you're kind of filling up. There's only a certain amount of protein that you can tolerate in one fucking sitting. Like just, even if you like meat, like there's only so much that you can eat. But I mean, yeah, look, I've found for me, since switching to that, it's definitely made just a subtle difference to, what I've been doing. Which I'd kind of go, another kind of topic I want to touch base on, and I know there's been kind of conflicting and or minimal research around this over the years. Nutrition for somatic types.
This guy needs some protein.
Yeah. But nutrition for somatic types. So like, is there any evidence to kind of support the different type of nutritional systems for, different, if someone's an endomorph, ectomorph, mesomorph? And then what is your kind of, empirical experience around that too? What would you,
I used to kind of make recommendations based on that. I think those have largely been kind of debunked in the scientific literature. The idea of there's a really funny image you can go to. It's like shows Christian Bale and Jared Leto, two actors who have, if you look at Christian Bale when he played Batman, mesomorph.
Yeah.
If you looked at when he played in The Machinist, ectomorph.
Yeah.
And then if you look at him when he played, Dick Cheney in that movie,
Endo.
So I think, there are people who tend to be a little bit bigger by default, a little bit, skinnier by default, but it doesn't really appear to be like a genetics. Well, maybe it is genetics based thing, but you can take somebody who's an endomorph and make them look like an ectomorph or make them look like a mesomorph, right? So I think the idea that the phenotype is tied to the genotype could be wrong. And I don't really, again, I think protein recommendations really just need to be tied to, lean mass.
Irrespective of where it's at. Yeah. And another thing is this whole concept of like, insulin resistance, which is kind of, people are like, okay, well, you shouldn't have carbs and stuff like that. Firstly, like, can you explain to the audience what actually insulin resistance is? And then secondly, how that kind of plays into the type of nutrition that people should be consuming?
So there's basically two forms of diabetes. The first form of diabetes, type 1 diabetes, is where you do not produce insulin. And that causes your blood sugar to rise because you have no insulin to drive it back down, right? Type 2 diabetes, which insulin resistance is the precursor to, is where you do produce insulin, but your body becomes insensitive to it. And so a normal amount of insulin will no longer suffice for disposing of glucose. And so your basal insulin levels go up, your meal insulin goes up, but at a certain point you still can't get your blood glucose back to a normal level. So that is insulin resistance, when you're secreting a normal amount of insulin, but your blood glucose is still elevated. So, and I'm not talking about elevated acutely. Like I'm talking about like your basal levels of blood glucose are elevated. And then if you eat a meal, like if you do an oral glucose tolerance test, typically in OGGT, you see, you take 75 grams of dextrose or glucose, you get a spike and it comes back down. And usually you've cleared all that by about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours is usually when a healthy person clears that in. But what you'll see is the area under the curve for somebody who's insulin resistant will be much greater, right? Because the peak amplitude is higher and it takes longer to clear. So that's kind of what you're dealing with. And now why are we concerned about that? Well, if you have chronic exposure to high levels of glucose, and I'm not talking about, you eat some carbohydrates, your blood glucose goes up, and it comes back down. Those short-term fluctuations aren't really anything to be worried about. But if you're chronically having high glucose, that is very toxic to the endothelial cells, and it's a very, very high risk for cardiovascular disease and a whole host of other problems. And high blood glucose tends to dysregulate everything else, like you start to have high blood lipids, and impedes all kinds of cellular signaling, and you get into this negative feedback loop where you're really, having a lot of things getting messed up. Now, how to treat that? about 70 to 80% of the improvements in insulin sensitivity are just going to be due to weight loss. Like if you lose weight, that's going to give you the vast majority of the benefits. Exercise also helps. But the idea you need to eat low carb, here's what I'll say about low carb. If you eat low carb, you will have a drop in blood glucose faster. Okay, so over the first 4 weeks, low carb will win. But if you
looking at it as a kind of a therapeutic tool to use initially to start turning the tide in the other direction.
Right. But if you look out like 6 months, really what it boils down to is how much weight you lose. Most measures, if you lose the same amount of weight, most measures at 6 months aren't different between low carb or even high carb diets, as long as calories are equated and weight loss is the same. So what that says to me is, okay, if low carb is sustainable for you, great. If you want to do that, great. But really, we need to focus on this long-term sustainability because that's what's going to produce the majority of the results. Obviously, you can get your blood glucose down faster. That's a little bit better. But really, we need to be looking at the long term. What I don't want people doing is doing low carb because they feel like they have to do low carb. And then they rebound and now they're back in the position they were in. We should still be looking at this from a sustainability perspective. And 100%, some people have said, well, if you're insulin resistant, you can't lose weight eating carbohydrates, and you need to do low carb. So we actually have a meta-analysis of where they compared people who either had insulin resistance or didn't on the same calorie deficit, and they showed that they did the exact same. Like they lost the same amount of weight. So this idea that weight loss is harder when you're insulin resistant is not true. And the idea you need to go do low carb is not true, although low carb may offer a slight advantage in the initial phases of weight loss.
And that's, look, clinically, back in our gyms, we used to, and sometimes we used to get a bad rap for it. It's like people would be like, oh, you guys are only giving low carb. I'm like, no, we're not. We'd use it initially as a therapeutic tool for that first kind of 3-4 week period, provided the client was committed to their goal. And then once they'd had that initial momentum and had adapted to it, then we'd reintroduce, more carbohydrates and give them the flexibility to do basically what they want to do. But the other, I think, key variable with insulin sensitivity is weight training. So talk to us about that and the role that weight training plays compared to, say, cardio. Because you get people that come in, they're like, okay, I'm going to come in and do low carb and then run every day, compared to someone who is maybe going to focus on their food and then do weights. Talk to us about the benefits of weight training and insulin sensitivity.
So I will say that any form of exercise is absolutely better than no exercise. No question about it. On a short-term basis, resistance training is probably not that much better than cardiovascular training if you're doing the same, like if you equate work, essentially. Or you equate energy expenditure. However, for the long term, what resistance training does is build lean tissue. Skeletal muscle is very energetically needy compared to some other tissues. And so, I hate using really general terms, but skeletal muscle kind of becomes like a metabolic sink. It gives you more places to do stuff. Right? Like if you have high levels of skeletal muscle mass, you can dispose of more glucose. You can dispose of more free fatty acids. You can dispose, it's harder to get these things elevated in your bloodstream and cause some of these problems. And we even see that with athletes who are obese, like offensive linemen and such. They still, on average, if they have higher skeletal muscle mass, well, if we take obese people on average, and we equalize them on their fat mass, right? But one group has more muscle mass. On average, the group that has more muscle mass will be in better metabolic health than those who have less muscle mass. So
you triggered something I heard recently from Peter Attia, where he spoke about some research or something around sumo wrestlers, and how obviously sumos are, they're definitely not stage ready,
No.
but but they've got so much muscle on them that metabolically speaking, they're a lot healthier than people give them credit for.
Yeah, you can, I guess the phrase I would use is you can get away with more, get away with more when you have more muscle mass.
And keeping on this topic of like insulin sensitivity, resistance and all that type of stuff and longevity, kind of what is the research showing around this in regards to kind of, optimal human health?
Well, when it comes to insulin resistance, it's probably one of the worst things that can happen for your health. I mean, it's pretty far up there. I have to look through some of the data to really quantify it. But I believe like after like heavy smoking, high blood glucose and insulin resistance is probably one of the worst things you can do for your health.
Wow.
Some people have argued that, that portion of it is actually what's unhealthy about obesity, that it's really the insulin resistance and high blood lipids that makes, obesity dangerous. Now, we do have new research that's come out in the last 10 years that showed that even people who have like healthy blood work, if they're obese, they have a higher risk of mortality than people who are not obese. So, okay. But I will say, if you're insulin sensitive and obese, you're still better off than being obese and non-insulin sensitive. So I think a lot of people, that's. I think one of the things I do well is nuance, and kind of explaining these things and not being dogmatic about it. A lot of people just tie everything together. And so I do think it's important to point these out, that like, hey, there's kind of levels to this, and you really have to like make appropriate comparisons,
Kind of change kind of gear here. One of the areas that probably isn't as well researched around nutrition, I would say, is, when it's applied in the context of like PEDs, right? So when people are on PEDs or anabolics or steroids or whatever it is, and how nutrition, I guess, works in that ecosystem or environment. Do things change, nutritionally speaking, when someone is on PEDs, making all things equal?
I love this question. Now, I will qualify it by saying I am going to speculate because there really aren't a whole lot of studies looking at people taking, PEDs for obvious reasons because it's hard to get approval through an IRB for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So what I will say is, the obvious one that people bring up is, well, you need more protein when you're on PEDs because you're building so much more muscle, right? You got to have more protein to support that. Well, let's examine that. So I think we can agree that like, even on steroids, like 25 pounds or like, let's say 12 kilos of skeletal muscle. That is a lot of muscle to add in a year, right?
Oh, yeah.
if we back that out, let me just get my trusty calculator here. If we back that out and we consider 12 kilos, 70% of that's fluid, because even if you put on pure muscle, 70% is fluid. So let's see, 12 kilos times 0.3 is the dry tissue weight. Cat, get off that computer because you'll turn it off. This is my new cat, everyone. Say hi, Chad. Okay, so that's 3.6 kilos of skeletal muscle, of contractile tissue or dry tissue. Then, so that's 3,600 grams, right? If we divide that by 365 days, you need an extra about 10 grams of protein a day to support that. Okay. So, if you're worried, have 3 grams per kilogram of lean mass plus 10 and you're covered. So I don't buy this whole, you need 500 to 600 grams of protein because you're building so much tissue. No, you don't. And I very much doubt you actually need an extra 10 grams anyway. But if you want to be, if you want to be safe, add 10 grams, add 20 grams for all I care. But, you don't need a drastically increased amount of protein. The other one is like calorie intake, right? Mm-hmm. Well, you're building more lean tissue. That is an energy expensive process. So it probably does raise your energy expenditure. So you may need some more calories, but again, it's probably not
on that one, just to jump in, so let's just say, and again, understanding, this would be just based off hypotheticals and your experience, but if someone is on anabolics and they're going through a bulking phase, and with what you've just said, and normally a natural person might be in a 10% surplus.
Yeah.
For argument's sake, if someone's on anabolics, is that a 15% surplus? Maybe.
What I would say is, just monitor your body weight, and if on average it's not increasing at the rate you want, increase your calories. I mean, it might. I think at best it's probably like maybe a couple hundred calories a day. Probably not even.
Yeah.
That. Okay. But, your mileage may vary. So, again, this is the beautiful thing about if you track data, if you're looking at your average body weights over multiple weeks, you can see whether or not it's increasing at the rate that you want. You can adjust accordingly.
That's why using an app like Carbon is so important.
Yes, go download Carbon.
Click the link in, below, guys, as well, if you want to get access to Layne's app there. But side note on that,
it's my emotional support game.
Definitely. So with that, though, we're talking about bulking. On that topic, what are some mistakes that people generally make when it comes to bulking? Putting on muscle, stuff like that. What are some of the common mistakes you see?
3 mistakes. First one, they do not do it long enough. They start to gain a little bit of body fat, get uncomfortable, and immediately go into a cut. That's the first one. Second one, not willing to accommodate enough body fat gain. So I always tell people, if you're not willing to accept a relative increase of 30%, then don't even bother trying. What I mean by that is I'm not saying go to 30% body fat or add 30% body fat. What I'm saying is if you are 10% body fat and you are not willing to go up to 13, which is 3% increase, and 3% is 30% of 10%, right? Then don't even bother with it. And then the next thing, and that kind of ties into not doing it long enough. And then the final thing is a lack of patience. So what I found so often, and it's so counterintuitive, and this is why human beings are such dumb animals. We don't do things logically. We like to think that we're logical, but we're just dumb creatures like every other, sentient being. So what we do is we don't like the idea of gaining body fat. But then, your weight, anybody who's ever done a really controlled bulk knows this. I'm just going to be in a 100-calorie surplus. That means, every 5 weeks I'm gaining a pound. Or every 5 weeks I'm gaining half a kilo. Oh, it doesn't work like that. It's like the first week you gain nothing. Second week you gain nothing. Third week you gain a half kilo. And you go, what the hell, right? So even if you're taking the averages, your weight can bounce all around. And people get discouraged by that. And what they tend to do is go, fuck it. I'm just going to increase the speed at which I bulk so I can get through it faster. And they put on a bunch of unnecessary body fat. And they go, oh, well, I got to the end. Stupid way to do things. You have to be patient. You have to be way more patient in a gaining phase than you are in a deficit. I mean, I look at people and they go, oh, fat loss is so hard. And not really. You're honestly, you are getting, if you're being adherent, you're going to be getting positive feedback pretty quickly. Because you can see visual changes on week to week during fat loss. You are not going to see visual changes, at least not the good visual changes week to week on a bulk. So I think that's really, if I had people who want to build a really good physique, especially drug-free, or people who are competitors, I always told my competitors, hey, shows are won in the off season. Anyone can starve themselves for 12 weeks and get shredded for stage. Okay? Not anyone, but you know what I mean. But the people who really do well, who make improvements, competition after competition, are people that put in the time in the off season. and maintain their focus in that time too. And so I think consistency in the gaining phase is very, very underrated.
And you made a good point, when you said they don't do it for long enough. Like, what is long enough? Like, let's use you and I. We're in our 40s, men, and over the next 12 months, I want to put on a few kilos of muscle and stay the same amount of body comp or less. Like, how long are we talking here?
I would say, especially as your training age gets up there, you're gonna have to go for longer. Because it's very hard to induce that growth signal when you've been doing it for so long. And if you don't want body fat to increase, you're gonna have to be pretty conservative with the rate that you do it. So I would say, like for example, if I was like, okay, I'm gonna try and put on some lean mass, like dedicated gaining phase. The reason I haven't really done that recently is because I'm in a weight class for powerlifting where I don't want to get too far outside that. I'd be looking at least 12 months if I wanted to put on like an actual 1 or 2 like kilo, or like if I wanted to put on like a half kilo or a kilo of lean mass. I mean, I'd be looking at least only 12 to 18 months. But I'm somebody who's been training hard for 20 years. Like it's not me putting on that amount of lean mass. It's going to require a lot of hard training and a lot of consistency and dedication.
I think it's a really good point, because a lot of people, it's like, okay, I'm going to do a bulk phase, but a bulk phase for a 40-year-old that's been training for 20 years compared to a bulk phase for a 25-year-old that's been training for 5 years are two very different things, right?
Absolutely. And I think that, you make a great point. Like, hey,
context matters.
If you're a year in, 3 to 6 months might be enough to put on a few kilos of lean mass. When you've been doing it for 10, 15, 20 years, like it's not that easy, And then that gets into well, how do you know when you've hit your genetic limit? You don't. You don't. There's no way to know. So you might as well go hard.
And one of the things people talk about, during a bulking phase and fat loss phase too, but is that whole concept of refeeding, right? Like, talk to, I guess, the science around refeeds, but then more practically, like, is that a tool that you coach with clients, that you deploy? Like, I know you talk about it in your, Biolayne nutrition certs, but like top level for the audience.
So I was big on refeeds, 10, 15 years ago. Now I file that under personal preference. There's really no data to suggest it's superior to kind of just eating the same thing every day, like physiologically. But like a lot of people, like it can fit into your lifestyle well. A lot of people like to have more calories on the weekends, during a fat loss phase. So you have a little more flexibility to either have a few drinks, go out with friends, all that kind of stuff. So, I think it's fine to incorporate, but there's just really no evidence it's better.
Yeah. Okay. And another thing then around reverse dieting, it's, such a vogue term. Like, what are people, well, firstly, what is the science supporting it? But then more importantly, how can people actually apply it correctly? Because I think that's the biggest mistake people do, is they don't apply it correctly.
Yeah, there's really no direct research on it. But there are some like controlled feeding studies where they've shown that, like, for example, if you overfeed in like if you overfeed above maintenance in a very small amount, that there's very little fat gain, and that it's mostly lean. Whereas like if you get more and more aggressive, more and more like calories, like, 30, 40, 50, 60% over maintenance, that the majority of which is deposited as body fat. Yep. There's also evidence that like as your caloric intake goes up, that you get spontaneously more active, your NEAT goes up, your total daily energy expenditure goes up. But I mean, at least anecdotally, it seems to be quite variable from person to person. So I've had people like, I've reversed them from, 1,400 calories up to, 2,500, and they haven't gained like a single ounce.
Okay.
And then I've had people who have, kind of linearly and steadily gained, weight throughout that period of time. So, I think I've come back off of it as being like, okay, this is how everybody should do it. Not necessarily everybody, but again, I just kind of look at it as a tool and a tool belt. And, at the end of the day, a good reverse diet and a good lean gaining phase are going to look pretty similar at the end of the day. So, I used to think that, if you reverse diet, you can get your BMR, much higher. We now have, quite a bit of evidence to suggest that your BMR probably doesn't increase that much other than just any increases in lean mass. And that if there is an increase in your daily energy expenditure, it's probably due to like becoming spontaneously more active. But that can happen. Like I've had people who they were, eating 1,600 calories a day, 1,700 calories a day, couldn't drop body fat. And then we increased their calories a little bit, and all of a sudden a few things happen. They get more consistent with things. They don't have blowouts because they don't feel so restricted. They can train harder, and they become spontaneously more active. So we've actually had people who drop quite a bit of body fat, and people will say, "Oh, well, they just got more adherent, they moved more." And okay, cool, it still works.
Yeah, and they probably got happier eating a bit more friggin' food too, right?
That's true. That's true. I like to say low calories make people crazy.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to kind of flip the switch from nutrition and actually kind of come into a little bit more about you, Layne. So like, around kind of mindset, business, like talk to us, like what does a day in the life look like for you in 2023? Obviously you've got multiple businesses, juggling kids, everything going on. What does a day in the life look like for Layne?
Assuming no travel or outside fuckery.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah. A normal-ish day. Not that you and I do fucking normal, but like a normal type of day.
Usually I'm up at like 6:30 or 7. Like right now it's summer, so the kids don't have school. If it's during the school year, I'm usually up at like 5:45 or 6. So
and do you have any kind of routine that you start your day with? Like,
if I get up and the kids don't get up with me, I'll usually go and I'll get a cup of coffee and I'll sit outside and I'll, kind of just enjoy the sunrise. Sunrise is behind my house, so I'm kind of looking at the sun glaring on the water over here. So I'll like enjoy the sunrise. I'll kind of like look through my emails and messages while I do that, like just like low energy business stuff. Then I'll like, eat a quick breakfast. I'll make the kids breakfast, whatever they want. I'll kind of like pick up around and everything, get the kids ready. Nanny will come around 8 o'clock. Both kids have summer camp. So she takes them to summer camp. I start work. Usually I'll start out, I'll do some story posts in terms of like whatever I'm promoting that day. Then I'll, sit down, answer emails. I'll look over the company finances. I usually do like check on the bank statements like pretty much every day, just because I want to make sure that there's no, that there's no like theft or anything like that. Not from like employees or anything, but.
Have you, and actually I'll jump in on that. Have you changed your approach to kind of like, as your business has grown and you've obviously got multiple education, supplements, apps, have you become more, and well, I know the answer to this, but how have you become more financially astute throughout that process? How have you transitioned from becoming just a coach to a business owner?
Well, I think, I do a lot more kind of like 10,000 foot view of things as opposed to being in the nuts and bolts of things every day. So kind of, really if there's an issue, it's getting brought to me by Samantha, our COO, or my personal assistant, Caroline. They really kind of like act as my shield so that I can just focus on what I'm good at, which is reading studies, doing content, and like just responding to emails and messages and stuff.
Of course.
So that's kind of like I've really focused on like just keeping myself educated on like the most recent research. I do still have a few clients, but I can. It's like 5 people, and I get them done in a few hours per week. So I'll do those things. I usually have like 1 or 2 business calls per day with various business partners like yourself, or my partner in Outwork, or with Carbon, or whatever it may be. Not so much there lately, but there were times when we were meeting weekly. So like all that sort of stuff, meetings. I'll usually and then like whatever I'm working on, like if I'm working on a book, if I'm working on some kind of project, those sorts of things. A lot of times I'm just like, honestly, I sit on social media a lot just because I'm wanting to see like what's hot right now that I could touch on and do content on, because that always makes the best content. Like for example, when the WHO a few weeks ago said they were going to put aspartame in the category of a possible carcinogen, I did content on that very quickly because I knew it would get a lot of traction because everybody's talking about it. It's a big topic of discussion. And so like one thing I was kind of like saying this in our PCA group, somebody said, I'm planning out my content calendar for 3 months. I understand that concept, and I think it's fine to have a framework. I think that's totally fine.
Yeah.
I admire that. But I think structured flexibility in all things, because if you're locked in for 3 months, you're really going to miss out on the best content you could put out there, which is, hitting on something while it's hot. When I did when the Game Changers came out, the documentary that was kind of like very pro-veganism, I got a lot of followers by hitting on that repeatedly in a short period of time.
You were at my house, my old house then.
Yeah. When the article dropped. Yeah. So, I do sit on social media a lot for that reason. And also I try to respond to as many people as I can just because I like helping. And so I'll do all that.
I'll add to that just quickly. I saw your post today in the community, and like I've been doing a lot more stuff personally on social recently myself, as I know you know, and I'm obviously very OCD and structured type person, but I saw your post and I'm like, fuck, he makes a good point there. And I can't not take on your advice there because it's clearly worked for you. I think, being able to kind of react to what is out there now as a creator and kind of get on the viral bandwagon.
Yeah. I mean, there's pluses and minuses to everything. Like obviously you don't want to just, like I don't completely fly by the seat of my pants. I 90% fly by the seat of my pants, but I do have like, okay, Monday I usually do like some kind of meme. Tuesday I do a reel of motivation or, training or something like that. Wednesday I do an educational reel. Thursday I'm usually doing some kind of like educational screenshot of my Twitter. Friday I'm doing a What the Fitness reel. Saturday, I'm doing whatever promotion I want or like a personal post. And then Sunday, I'm usually talking about my own training, right? So I'm like, I know what I'm kind of talking about. I have a general outline.
You got your pillars.
I can kind of like pick what grabs me. And the same thing with memes. Like, as funny as it sounds, like, a good example is, a couple years ago when, like a year and a half ago when Will Smith slapped Chris Rock.
Yeah.
Like I realized, like, I'm not trying to make fun of Chris Rock.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
For him. But like that's great content. It's like, I can make a nutritional like meme about that using that, and it gets a ton of traction because everybody's posting about those particular things. So again, I think it's just important to have structure and flexibility with that. So I'll do all that stuff I'm kind of talking about, do some writing, and I'll do that usually till about 2 or 3 p.m. And then I'll go train. And then I'll usually train until about 5 or 6. I'll come home. That's at the same time when like my son has therapy till 5:30, so my kids usually get home around 5:45 or 6. And once the kids get home, I'm in dad mode for the rest of the day until they go to bed. And once they go to bed, I'll usually like just do something easy, like do a Q&A or something like that on my Instagram, or put up stories I missed during the day, or read messages or read emails or whatnot. I'll do that for like an hour, hour and a half, and then I'll go to bed. So, the people who are like, oh, I grind, I do 12 hours a day. Cool. I do 7 or 8 hours a day. But I make those hours count. And I do think when I focus on stuff, I can get what takes most people 3 or 4 hours. I can get it done in probably like an hour. I'm usually pretty speedy when it comes to that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think like obviously I always talk to people about like work and entrepreneurship. It's like a training program. Sometimes you do periods of high volume where you do 12, 15-hour days. And for you to get to where you've done that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, you've done that for so long, but people look at now and say, oh, well, 7, 8 hours a day. But that 7, 8 hours a day is like the amount of experience that's the equal of 15 hours a day back in the day.
Right. I mean, now I've got the snowball rolling. You know what I mean? Now I'm just kind of giving it a push here and there. You know, I don't have to keep pushing it up the hill. We're rolling down the hill, you know. And, you know, the other thing I tell people is like, hey, I run the marathon. You know, I've always been good at running marathons without ever having actually run a marathon. You know,
delayed gratification.
Yeah, I'm just like, I don't need it right now. You know, like I just know like, okay, I can do that 14-hour day, but the quality of my work's going to go through, you know, and I'm going to end up getting to the point where I'm feeling burnt out. And I've been around people who do those 14-hour days. And guess what happens after a few weeks? They go, oh, I need a week off, you know, and it's like, cool. And here's the tortoise back here, just putting in my 8 hours a day. And okay, see you later, you know, while you're taking your week off, you know.
Yeah.
So I've very rarely dealt with burnout. I mean, I've had burnout from like life stuff, which I'm kind of in right now, but I've never like felt super burnt out from my work more than like maybe a day or two. And so I've never like, one of the complaints I've gotten from, you know, both of my exes is, well, why don't you ever want to take a vacation? And it's like, well, I don't really ever feel like I need to because like I don't feel like I'm that overwhelmed, you know. But you know, not that I don't like vacations. I like vacations as much as anybody else. But you know, I've never gotten to the point where I've been like, man, I need a vacation. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's also because I mean, when you love what you do, it ain't fucking work, right?
Yeah, I mean, some days it's work, but you know, for the most part, I'm you know pretty excited, and I do something that I get a great deal of, I get a lot of joy out of it. I have my days. The last few days have been some of those days, but you know, for the most part, I get a lot of meaning out of what I do, and so, you know, it still feels like work, but it's, you know, it's something that's rewarding, and I think, you know, if you can do stuff that like you feel is meaningful, I think it's hard to be, you know, burnt out when you're doing something you feel is meaningful.
I agree. And people see it, right? Like people see it. I think it's how you build an audience. It's how you build a community because they see the passion. They see that you actually enjoy it. And you'd be doing this stuff whether you're getting paid or not, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the nice, you know, nicest things I hear from people when they meet me, you know, Brian Mark really gave me such a nice compliment, like on stage, but then also off stage. He was like, you know, you're like one of the most genuine dudes I've ever met. Like, you know, how you are is how you are. Like, it's not an act, you know, like you are very fired up. You're very passionate. You are into it. You know, it's not some kind of act, you know, and I think, you know, I can say after being in the industry 20 years, I've got a pretty good motor, you know?
Definitely. Well, look, I want to wrap up with just some fireside questions. So what I'm going to do is, well, it's actually more like fireside comments. I'm going to say a word or a comment, and then I want you to respond with kind of, you know, the first thing that comes to mind with this, okay?
Oh, boy. Okay.
Weed.
Inappropriately demonized, but also probably the pendulum has swung too far as well, where people like, you know, it's a health thing, and I'm like,
yeah,
I think it's better for you than alcohol for sure, but you know, there's almost always trade-offs. But I think as far as like, you know, inebriants go, marijuana seems to be like very, you know, it's basically non-toxic and very few like long-term side effects.
Well, you have a lot of people, I guess, in the motivation space, the entrepreneur space, are like, you know, cut this out, cut that out, don't do that, don't touch that. And 100%, like if you're sitting at home at your parents' place smoking weed all day and drinking every day and not doing anything with your life, then you should probably stop doing it.
Yeah.
But like, you know, if you're doing it once in a while to de-stress and laugh a bit more, who cares? Left or right?
Right.
Biden.
Oh boy. Not a fan. not a fan.
Trump.
Not particularly a fan either. But more of a fan of him. Okay, more of a fan of his policies than I am of Biden's policies. That's what I'll say.
Yep. No, I definitely agree with that. Kennedy.
Not a fan of him as a human being.
Kennedy, RFK.
Makes some good points, but goes off the deep end with a lot of stuff.
Yep. Liver King.
Scammer.
Joe Rogan.
Tries to get it right. Sometimes gets too impassioned about the wrong stuff, but I think is
heart's in the right place.
Trying to do his best.
Yep.
I think it comes from a good place.
Election 2024.
Shit show. It's going to be a shit show.
Yeah. Mainstream media.
Not reliable.
Government transparency.
Doesn't exist.
America today versus America in 1950. It's a deep one, isn't it?
I think everyone tends to look back with rose-colored glasses. I don't necessarily think things are worse now than they were back then. If you look at the actual objective statistics, there's less people living in poverty. If we equate poverty, like hunger and whatnot, now poverty is, you don't have a car and you don't have an Xbox. You know what I mean? Like, not to minimize it. There are some people living in abject poverty, so I don't want to minimize it. But it's more rare now than it was in the 1950s, and violent crime is until COVID. Before COVID, violent crime was at the lowest I think it had ever been. And there's more social mobility. I think by most objective measurements, things are actually better now. But we tend to look back with rose-colored glasses.
I think people kind of confused probably the culture wars that is occurring right now, globally, but in particular North America, as like that's where they're looking at it from. But you're right, like in terms of quality of life, access to food, everyone having a fridge in their house.
Right. I always do the comparison. Okay, if I could be the richest person in the world in 1900, or I could be middle class now, which one am I picking? I'm picking middle class now because I've got Netflix, central air conditioning, and Xbox. Thank you very much.
Layne at 50.
Doing the same dumb shit I'm doing now, probably.
just with a few more gray hairs.
I don't really feel like I've grown up, Everybody's like, oh, you got your stuff together. I'm like, not really. Not really.
I was saying that I put out a post yesterday, love, lift, and laugh from a place of gratitude. And just that whole concept sometimes of being an inner kid, right? Like, I think we lose that as we go through life and marriages and business and stuff like that. But, I'm all for just sometimes being a clown and fucking laughing it out. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'll tell you this. Like, I kind of told you when I got on here, like, I've been in a funk, like, the last week, and I've been really kind of in a dark place. But, if I step back and I zoom out, people, like, I get asked sometimes, like, these deep questions, like, what's the meaning of life? Like, what keeps you going? Hey, look, everybody goes through bad periods of time, times where they feel uninspired, times where they feel like things are going to get better. The reality is life is so cyclical. If it's bad now, it's going to get good again, unless you continue to make really poor choices. And if it's good, it's probably going to get bad again at some point as well. And trying not to, like, judge those periods and just, ride it as much as you can. I always tell people, like, hey, look, the worst possible thing that could happen is I'm dead. And if I'm not dead, I've got options, right? So
yeah,
I would say that overall, I have been so fortunate to have like probably dozens of moments in my life that most people would just kill for like one of those.
Yeah.
You know? Like I've had so many amazing moments that were, culminations of like really long, arduous processes. And so I always tell people, like, no matter what, like I'm going to ride this thing for everything it's worth. Like I feel like I've actually had a pretty, despite like me feeling like I've made a lot of mistakes, I feel like I've had a pretty epic life. And I always tell people, hey, you know what? I'm going to show up and play the game. And, that might mean I burn bright. It might mean I crash and burn, but I'm going to go hard, and just let the call.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, we all trip and fall. I think, what separates those that actually go out there and realize their full potential is when they fall, they get back up.
It's the only choice you have. I had a friend check on me today and they were like, hey, how you doing? Are you okay? I'm like, I'm not, but I will be.
Yeah.
I know that, so I think
Definitely.
when you know that, it allows you to, even when you're feeling really shit, it allows you to continue pushing forward, and I think that's a mistake a lot of people make is they get down, they get in the hard part of life and they stop moving their feet, because they feel like things are never going to get better. And what I'll say is like, just keep your feet moving, man, like even if things are bad, like just keep pushing forward because eventually you're going to come out of that. And if you keep pushing, you're going to be in a much better position than if you just kind of like said, oh, I'm just going to like take it easy or, not try because things are hard right now. Keep your feet moving.
Definitely. All right, brother. Well, look, appreciate you coming on today, brother. Obviously, guys, if you're listening now, you know where to find Layne. Biolayne, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, biolayne.com. Go and have some family time now, brother. Appreciate you as always. We'll talk soon.
All right.
All right. See you, man. Bye.